to say something I'm not supposed to say.
That's okay. That's the whole point.
The Islamic Republic of Iran.
Obama was the worst president in modern American history.
You know, they say don't talk sex or religion, but really you just shouldn't talk about the Jews.
Don't talk politics and religion, but above that is don't talk Israel-Palestine.
Just don't, because somebody's going to get pissed off, and then you always have the one uneducated that thinks he knows everything, that then gets really emotional when you say one thing and that shatters every thing they think. Hi, welcome to Unfiltered. I'm your host, Adam Scott Bellos, and today I am with a very special friend and special guest of mine, Samuel Hyde, who is a writer and a researcher who came from Cape Town. You advise and work with a NatWilf as well as the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. And you've published in Newsweek, Haaretz, Fathom, the Jerusalem Report, Jerusalem Post. You even worked for the Institute of Security, right?
Did some work for them, but then I also worked for Institute for Monitoring Peace and Tolerance,
right?
The education. And currently now I'm actually at the Jewish People Policy Institute as a research fellow.
How has your life changed since October 7th?
Well, my life in some ways has changed significantly, in other ways it hasn't. And I think that that's maybe not a unique experience for Israeli society. I was obviously, by de facto with the work I do, I was thrown into from October 9th, about 13 to 14-hour work days up until the beginning of January. So I never actually had much time to almost process certain things on a human level. So I only started processing October 7th in like mid-January as Samuel, as an individual. So that was interesting to have a 2-month pause in that. It was almost a coping mechanism. If I was going to do research and analyze things, I had to, in a way, disconnect and view it from a bird's eye view.
A lot of us that are
100%.
Analysts or commentators or whatever who used like our work to numb us from like the thing that we've kind of poured our heart and souls into.
One of the things that was incredibly challenging, and I don't know if you had the same experience, was we, at the same time as I spoke about that emotionally, it was a delayed reaction for me. At the same time, what played into it was the global reaction as well. It was like, as Israelis, we didn't even have October 7th. I mean, there were still Hamas terrorists in the country at the same time as Palestine activists were chanting "Gas the Jews" outside the Sydney Opera House.
Before our Air Force even started preparing for the ground troops, they were already calling for a ceasefire once we were cleaning up the Gaza envelope.
Yeah, well, I call that the difference between peace activism and pacifism, because, a peace activist would recognize a fundamental awakening after October 7th, that there is absolutely no ability and no room to negotiate with an Islamic jihadist organization.
How can you call that even pacifism? I call it terrorism. And I also think that they knew we were going to annihilate them afterwards, but we're okay with what was done to us.
No, it depends on who you're speaking about. If you're speaking about these specific organizations who are leading these protests, for sure, I'd concur with what you're saying. If you're speaking about some, average, everyday liberal somewhere along the line who says we need a ceasefire and they're speaking about it now, it comes from an element of pacifism, and pacifism requires privilege because it means that you have a choice in order to not engage in some level of conflict.
They had pacifist privilege.
Yeah, pacifist privilege.
Did you say Susan Sarandon has pacifist privilege?
Yeah, and I'd say she has a lot of anti-Semitic tendencies as well.
Would you say that Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib have pacifist privilege?
No, I'd say that they're glorifiers of levels of martyrdom. And maybe they've secularized the way in which they speak about that for their base in the US. But if you compare the fundamental ideas and the way in which they speak about resistance or about liberation or whatever, it's fundamentally the underlying substrata to that, and the way the Islamists speak in the Middle East is very different.
That was kind of like the plan, though, of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was to inculcate themselves into the far left, the social movements.
But I actually took it a step further recently, because I've been thinking about this a lot, that link between the far left, let's say the progressivism and Islamism. And I actually think that the idea that this kind of coalition between unhinged Western progressives and Muslim conservatives is not solely a result of like this Islamic predatory behavior and leftist naivety in the West. I think that there's a fundamental alignment of principles between these two parties, which
For
might,
sure.
which might seem
That's
odd.
why it works.
Exactly. So I don't say that it's just, leftist naivety. I think that a lot of leftists, hard leftists in the progressive front, opened the door to this. People were like Judith Butler were like, well, come in and take a seat. She was saying Hamas and Hezbollah are social movements of the global left already in 2006, and she's very influential. And you can really see the outcome of that kind of thinking today in universities. To some degree, it's a Marxist infiltration, but I think more accurately, it's actually a Stalinist. Obviously,
Yeah,
the Soviet
to be
Union
more
was
specific, yeah.
Marxist, Leninist, but specifically the Soviet Union had a dramatic influence in the Arab world's ideology from the 1960s onwards. And there's this confluence. But when we speak about this kind of secular left, I actually have been making the argument recently that while these people may identify as secular, their ideology and the way in which they practice, especially their concept of the morally failed Jew, is incredibly, incredibly aligned in some sort of modern incarnation with the ancient church, and it's rooted in this kind of concept of the original sin. It's
all of the
Christian fundamentalists, really.
Yeah, all of the anti-Semitism that I have seen since October 7th, that's not specifically like Zionism, Israel related, like Zionism is racism. It, weirdly enough, is not just anti-nationalism. It's a mix of the anti-religion and the anti-racial anti-Semitism of both the church and the Nazis mixed with new anti-Semitism of anti-Zionism is racism and so on and so forth.
Anti-Semitism has traditionally mutated, and it always relies on the greatest authority of the time. So when the church was the greatest authority of the time, it relied on religion. And when science was the greatest authority of the time, it relied on scientific discoveries. And today,
now it relies on TikTok.
Yeah, TikTok, but also the concept of human rights today is very linked to the idea actually of church and the original sin. I call it the human rights regime because I don't take these people seriously.
What was it like for you being South African, watching the court case and like the terrible presentation that the South Africans gave, and then everybody like reacting like, oh my God, it's a slam dunk, whatever, when clearly they provided zero evidence of intent, which is what the whole case needed to be about in order to prove it. And then the Israelis, I would say, did an 8 out of 10, 7 out of 10 in presenting their case. But then, compared to what South Africa did, it was a 10 out of 10. What was that like for you to see not only like the reaction before the Israelis presented, but then after the verdict came in?
I wasn't surprised or shocked that South Africa filed this in the first place.
Well, they were broke 4 days before October 7th, and then all of a sudden they had money. So
precisely, there's an election coming up in a few weeks or a few months, but it's coming up very shortly. And according to the South African Constitution, a party that is bankrupt cannot run in an election. Now, the ANC ruling party have been in power for 30 odd years, 30 years this year, in fact. And they were bankrupt. They filed bankruptcy in July of last year. It just so happened that they pulled their filing of bankruptcy about a week and a half after the ICJ, and that was 2 weeks before there was a massive investment by the Islamic Republic in Iran into trade investments in the country. But I was not shocked or surprised that South Africa took on this symbolic role on behalf of essentially the dictators of the Arab world, because I think the grave misperception, especially in the West, among the liberal establishment of South Africa, is that it almost serves as the global conscience of the world. It is this universalist country which has managed to successfully move past its racist past, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's really just not true. That's a fabrication, but it's precisely what makes the South African government and that symbolic nature of what South Africa represents as an absolutely perfect public relations proxy for states like Iran and whatever. So I was not surprised that it came in, because that link to Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran has been growing steadily since the early 2000s and increasingly since about 2017.
One of the things that you've always been is a very big proponent of a two-state solution or some type of land compromise. And I know you were very heavily involved with the judicial reforms.
What I've always actually said is that the essence of this conflict is very simple to understand and very difficult to solve.
Rejection of Jewish sovereignty.
Well, yeah, I've always said that it really at the core of this conflict is a nearly century-long idea where the Jews want a state and the Palestinians want the Jews to not have that state.
Right.
There's no solution, whether it's two states or one state, as long as that is the predominant idea leading Palestinian nationalism and Palestinian politics. That is the argument I've always made. I was never for just instituting a two-state solution, thinking that somehow this would work out into some peaceful reality. What I've advocated for is essentially what is in the best long-term interests of the state of Israel. I believe from a diplomatic and legal, as well as an economic perspective, as well as from a perspective of the survival, the continuation, and the thriving of the Zionist project itself, which is based on a few fundamental principles like a Jewish majority democracy, that essentially a division of land that separates us from the Palestinians will be in the best long-term interests of the Jews in the 21st century. That's where my argument has always stemmed from. And from then I've gone into the economic policies of how, for example, the settlement project, and which, to be clear, I've written very, very clearly that when you actually look, this was all already established basically in the Oslo Accords and the 2000 Camp David Accords. The main settlement blocks, which represent about where 85% of the population live, are not up for negotiation. I've never advocated for removing 85% of people from their homes. I'm speaking about these outposts and these settlements that are built in the middle of nowhere, essentially, that do constitute a security burden on the state of Israel, that do constitute a legal and diplomatic burden, that constitute an economic burden. So basically, that is where it's come down to me. And I think that the conversation that we actually need to be having right now is a paradox, because on the one hand, a fundamental flaw in Israeli policy for quite some time is that we've ignored the Palestinian issue. But at the same time, while we've ignored the Palestinian issue, what we've also done is essentially we have created an entire social and political worldview that makes every single decision about Israel's interest based on the Palestinians and the conflict. And I call that the politics of resentment. Right. And resentment is a political force that is often not given the credit that it deserves in creating unhealthy societies and collapses of societies. This is pretty much held true for, centuries of political history, which we look at. What I mean by this is we very rarely make a political decision and say, well, even if it comes with a sacrifice for ourselves, what is in our best long-term interests? Forget about the Palestinians for a moment. What is in our best long-term interests? We really do not actually ask ourselves that question enough. What I meant by ignoring the Palestinian issue, and this comes into what I'd been writing at least for the last 3 years, the concept and the perception in which was created by Israeli governments, I'd say from probably 2009 onwards, it became a predominant force. It's understandable after what happened with the peace process up until 2008. It's almost understandable because a one-state solution is a diabolical idea. A two-state solution seems totally unrealistic. So the concept of managing the conflict comes about maintaining the status quo. That's instituted as well and instilled by the...
I do believe the peace process died on October 7th.
There's a lot of people who are saying things like post-October 7th, the peace process collapsed. The peace process collapsed already in the 90s. And I'm going to tell you why. One of my colleagues at JPPI is Dennis Ross. He was the chief negotiator in both the Camp David where the Israelis offered a sovereign independent Palestinian state, thereby ending the occupation, no settlements or equivalent land exchange values, and a capital for the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. The greatest misconception that the peace camp have ever had is that there were negotiations. There were no negotiations. There were serious Israeli peace offers and blanket Palestinian rejections based on the concept of the right of return into sovereign Israel. We can both acknowledge that this has been, and in many cases, even as it stands today, remains a regional war. Whether you move your border from here to there doesn't make a difference, because at the end of the day, what you're going to do once you've moved your border to there is all the people who are your allies and who you've signed, let's even call them non-aggression pacts with. I'm not even going to call them peace deals, non-aggression pacts with. Okay, that all of a sudden falls to pieces and collapses. So essentially, you've done nothing for security by moving your border from one place to the other. The Palestinians want a regional war, but they won't get away with it because they've lost the ability to read the regional room.
Right.
And then we had a whole conversation on that. But
that's right. That's right. Yeah.
I'd totally forgotten that was a conversation that was
But it's true. And if you look at the reaction to October 7th from the Arab world, whatever statements like they had, nobody had their back. You know, like they clearly.
At the end of the day, all the neutrality is essentially just a means to attempt to calm down the Arab streets. The interesting thing for me is exactly what you said about drawing Israel's border is exactly what, over the last year and a half, I've been writing about. The question is where's the border and what does it constitute? I believe that I've looked into this enough to see exactly where the settlement blocks that were built according to the Alon plan is a strategic security advantage, and which ones do not, and actually contribute to the burden of the security. As I've said before, fundamentally, the Palestinian cause and this war will only end once that is adapted. The war will continue until the Palestinians reform essentially their national project to one that envisions a state for themselves next to a Jewish state. That's it. But if you want to speak about security, then here's the data. Pre-October 7th, 75% of Israel's overall active military were deployed to the West Bank, leaving only 25% to be spread across two border fronts with Gaza, with Hamas on the other side, an entire border front with Lebanon, with Hezbollah on the other side, the Arava Strip with Jordan, the Golan and you got Syrian militant groups on the other side, and then Sinai. So you've got 25% of your overall military spread across 5 to 6 border fronts. And in one area, you got 75%. This was unsustainable. And I wrote about this, settlements and security, an illusion. And what I posited in that article in July last year was that we were susceptible to an invasion into sovereign Israel precisely because the deployment of our troops was so degraded and so illogical. Here's the thing, there's an entire perception that went into creating all these symptoms. Okay, and the perception was, since 2009, Netanyahu created a worldview in that you could negotiate with a jihadist Islamist group who are religious fundamentalists through economic means, and he had this whole rational approach, which was totally irrational and never going to work. It was a failed perception, in my opinion, to think that through economic means you could rationalize essentially with an Islamic fundamentalist group. The second thing is what we're doing now is what should have happened in 2014. The perception was all wrong. Of course, what I'm speaking about the deployment of troops is not the only sole factor. There's many factors that go into this. But what I'm deeply, deeply concerned about is that what we're going to do as Israeli society is both brilliant for one reason and gets into a lot of conceptual mistakes for the same reason. We have this unique and unbelievable ability to experience trauma and push forward. Okay, but through pushing forward, while it has created an incredible, successful country in so many ways, we also miss fundamental flaws and failures that are going on because we don't take the time to investigate them properly. Okay, so you can say, yes, the camera systems above and below ground and the radar systems created this perception that the Gaza border was controlled and that Hamas could be deterred, and we had all the technology to handle that. Okay, so the reality is that these guys have been planning this for years. So you can't turn around and say that, okay, we had 27 battalions on the Gaza border, but there was 5 battalions on the morning of October 7th. Where were the other 22? The other 22 were sent into the West Bank because between the settlers and the Palestinians, they were rioting for 3 nights before, and there was mass violence outbreaking there. You can't blame that decision and that move on October 7th. This had obviously been planned for weeks. But you cannot be in a security paradigm when we are surrounded by these groups in which you leave your borders vulnerable at any moment. Biden has both been brilliant and terrible at the same time, right? He's had moments of brilliance one cannot take away what he did post-October 7th. He came to the country. Bibi Netanyahu was nowhere to be found in the first 2 weeks after October 7th. Biden provided more support, even on an emotional level, for Israeli society. And that's why in the polls, that's what the polls actually showed. We did research into this, that Biden, Israelis felt more supported by Biden than their own prime minister, their post-war strategy. That's the problem, right? You didn't want Trump there on October 7th because he's a loose cannon. You don't know what you're getting with him. You wanted someone stable, someone.
I mean, if Trump would have been in office, this probably wouldn't have happened.
It's an argument that can be made, but it can't be guaranteed. I think Trump is a horrible human being, and I'd absolutely never vote for him. But the reality of the matter is that the Trump administration's foreign policy on the Middle East was some of the best foreign policy that the American administration has had in decades. That's an objective reality to me. I'm not gonna lie to myself because I'm a liberal, okay, and say that Trump was, somehow for the Middle East the worst thing that could have happened. At the end of the day, Kushner's ideas that start leading towards the Abraham Accords, although there was a lot of Israeli and Arab stuff happening for years before that, Kushner's paradigm change, you got to give credit where credit is due. And I'm never going to take that away from that administration. But the thing that I want to say is that on Gaza, a civilian presence in Gaza did not prevent Operation Days of Penitence or Days of Rainbow. There was thousands of rockets being fired for years before our pullout from Gaza. I think that a huge problem with political thinkers is this almost obsession with thinking that structures fix problems. No, any structure that exists is the outcome of a social or societal problem. Okay, at the end of the day, October 7th proved one thing to me about the Palestinians. These are a people with high capabilities, abilities, and skills. Okay. Mass ability to develop regional economic cooperation, even under a partial blockade. Okay. The problem with the Palestinians is their priorities. That's the problem. Okay. Their priorities. So I'm not going to deal with building some sort of structure and reform program. I worked in a lot of think tanks, and think tanks are obsessed with ideas of reform. So when you look at UNRWA, I was dedicated for 2 years. It was my sole job to work and develop reforms for UNRWA. Not now in the think tank I'm working at a one before. And that involved education. It involves a whole bunch of stuff. I was asked to give a talk a few weeks ago on this topic. And I said, the precise reason I know that UNRWA cannot be reformed is because I spent 2 years of my life, 9 to 5, working on various iterations of reform, which were never going to work in the first place. Okay, UNRWA, Hamas, remember, Hamas is not the core issue. Hamas is an outcome of the core issue. Hamas is an iteration of the Palestinian.
It's a symptom.
The jihadist version of the Palestinian cause, for sure. There's many different iterations of it. But at the end of the day, the core essence lies in this concept. Okay, this war still emerges from the fact, okay, that the Palestinians inherently believe, more so than anything, that their priority at all costs and by any means necessary is to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. So that is always going to be the thing. This is why when people are like, oh, okay, we could restructure this and reform this and we could redevelop this, when you actually look at reforms that have undergone in countries where there's been previous wars or fascist regimes or dictatorships, it was not a result of someone coming in and instituting some structure on a population. It developed naturally from a period of immense self-reflection from that population who decided to forge a constructive path. The misconception of the structural idea forms post-World War II from the American occupation of Japan. The Americans did was a fundamental flaw, okay? Was not successful just because they implemented democratization, demilitarization, educational reforms.
It never did educational reforms here. That's the problem.
Never did educational reforms. But Japan went from an imperialist fascist regime that was constantly attacking its neighbors to a population of Pikachus and karaoke. You know what the issue with educational reforms are, which I've also worked on before, and it was something that I tried to shift away from because there have been many proposals, whether they've come from independent think tanks or whatever. There's been a lot of proposals on educational reform because the educational system itself and what's being taught to children in Gaza and the West Bank is as horrific as people may imagine.
Yeah.
But the thing is what people fundamentally misread is that no peoples agree to educate their children against their core beliefs and principles.
Right.
So therefore, what is in Palestinian education is
their core belief
of what is in their society. Okay.
Right.
The UAE, for example, and Saudi Arabia, we've seen this. Saudi Arabia has
they eradicated it. They eradicated it from their core education system.
Exactly. At the precise time that
Right.
Saudi started openly talking about peace with Israel,
Right.
it eradicated anti-Zionism, all these conspiracy theories about Jews from it. The UAE, from making peace with Israel,
did the exact same thing.
Did the exact same thing. There's a process in Palestinian history, which I call initiation of aggression, celebratory triumphalism, collective amnesia, and righteous victimhood. And what I mean by that is it's present in 47 and 48 and 67, 2000, and it's currently playing itself out before our eyes.
Right.
The initiation of aggression in 47 against the Yishuv, with the goal to prevent the establishment of the State of Israel, openly by leadership and society for quite some time. The failure, which is accompanied by celebratory triumphalism, as if the goal has already been achieved in the midst of the war. Followed by a military defeat, okay? And with that military defeat, all the goals of the Palestinian and Arab people to prevent the establishment of the State of Israel are forgotten. It becomes a story of righteous victimhood in which the 1948 war becomes a narrative in the Palestinian mind of only displacement. There's no part for them in this. The same thing can be said about 67. Months and months leading up to 67, there was celebratory moments throughout the Arab world and among the Palestinians, reminiscent of, if the listeners can imagine this, the Americans in the streets of New York cheering on and kissing each other.
Yeah, because they thought they were going to be eliminating us.
Israel's end was near and that they were going to overturn the result of 1948. So the celebration, the initiation of aggression, and upon the military defeat, the collective amnesia, all those ideas and goals go out the window and it becomes a narrative of solely occupation, right? This is the fundamental collective consciousness issue among the Palestinian population that constantly leads to more wars and rejections of peace deals. That is something that will need to undergo a fundamental failure, because if you look at Japan, if you look at Serbia, if you look at Rwanda, if you look at Argentina after the Falklands War, that process, an initiation of aggression, celebratory triumphalism, and then the defeat is all present in those examples. The difference is that it was not a structure, it was not a reform, it's that all those populations underwent a process of self-transformation, self-reflection, and created a new constructive goal. And it was successful for all those peoples in different ways.
I think we can tell that the Palestinian national movement hasn't had a structured goal for some fucking time. Well, Sam, I have to thank you for joining me on Unfiltered. It's a pleasure to have you. As usual, it's always a great conversation. You can follow Sam at Samuel Hyde on Instagram. I believe you're also on X.
Samuel Joshua Hyde.
Samuel Joshua Hyde, but same thing as X, right?
Yeah, Samuel J. Hyde 11, I think.
Thank you for coming. It was a pleasure to have you. And we're done.